I'm going to talk about Nietzsche's naturalism, and I'm going to proceed on the assumption that most of you may not know, may have a certain perception of Nietzsche that's a bit out of sync with what I want to say about him. Heidegger, of course, had a very influential and spectacularly wrong reading of Nietzsche, but it's been very influential. There was a French deconstructionist appropriation of Nietzsche, which is quite misleading. So I think it's important to start by putting Nietzsche into a bit of his intellectual and historical context. So let's go back to mid-19th century Germany. This will be a slightly potted history, and I'm happy to talk about, say more about it in Q&A. Hegel dies in 1831 during the cholera epidemic that is sweeping Europe. In the 1830s, you have left Hegelians and right Hegelians fighting it out. By the 1840s, Hegel is falling out of favor. Schopenhauer's spectacularly hostile polemics against Hegel are becoming very popular, but the two main developments from the 1840s and after are, on the one hand, a kind of back to Kant movement, the first wave of what became known as neo-Kantianism, and on the other hand, you had the rise of what was known as German materialism. Feuerbach and Marx are probably the figures best known today associated with German materialism, but they actually weren't the really important ones for most intellectuals at the time, including Nietzsche. The main figures were a mix of doctors, physiologists, and natural scientists. Some are well known. Hermann von Helmholtz is a major figure in 19th century German physiology. Helmholtz was also a neo-Kantian who had the unusual view that discoveries about the physiology of the senses actually vindicated Kant's claim about how our knowledge of the world depends on the distinctive cognitive structure of the human mind. Okay? So Nietzsche is born in 1844. He is, as many of you probably know, trained in what was then called classical philology, what we now call classics. In 1866, so he's 22 years old, he discovers a recently published book by Friedrich Lange called The History of Materialism. Now, this was quite an important book in the 19th and well into the 20th century. In fact, there's an English language edition in the 1920s with an introduction by Bertrand Russell. And Lange's book is, as its title suggests, a history of materialism, or what we might call naturalism, from antiquity all the way up to the present, including German materialism. Here's what Nietzsche wrote in a letter of 1866, just to give an idea of how important this was to him. He writes, Kant, Schopenhauer, this book by Friedrich Lange, I don't need anything else. And he called it undoubtedly the most significant philosophical work to have appeared in recent decades. In 1868, he calls it a real treasure house. This is in another letter, and he mentions in particular Lange's discussion of the materialist movement of our time. Okay? Now, what did these German materialists believe? They took their inspiration particularly from developments in physiology. Here's how Herbert Schnadelbach, a well-known commentator on the intellectual history of the period, puts it. He says, physiology became the basis for modern scientific medicine, and this confirmed the tendency identifiable throughout the whole of the 19th century towards integration of human and natural sciences. So consider, for example, one of the most important materialist authors of the time, though largely forgotten today, a man named Ludwig Büchner, who was a medical doctor who wrote in 1855 a book called Force and Matter, Kraft and Stuff. This book was a bestseller in Europe. He was you can think of him as a little bit like the Richard Dawkins of his time, except he was a popularizer of physiology and other life sciences. It was actually the book, this is an interesting aside, it was the book that a young Albert Einstein read that got him quite interested in science. Here's a typical quote from Buchner. He says, "The researches and discoveries of modern times can no longer allow us to doubt that man, with all he has and possesses, be it mental or corporeal, is a natural product like all other organic beings." Right? And he goes on to say later in the book, "Not merely what man is, but also what he does, wills, feels, and thinks depends upon the same natural necessity as the whole structure of the world." Okay? German materialism took over sort of the popular intellectual culture in the 1850s and 60s, and it made a very profound impact on Nietzsche. And this is the important point about his intellectual biography. In early 1868, right, so he's not yet 24 years old, he actually contemplated switching from classics or classical philology to chemistry as his main field. As some of you may know, his first field was theology. Nietzsche is perhaps the most spectacular dropout from theology in the history of the West. Starting in the late 1860s, he also began very extensive reading about the life sciences, about physiology, about natural sciences, and this continued well into the 1880s. In his rather unusual autobiography, Ecce Homo, he writes that in the late 1870s, a truly burning thirst took hold of me. Henceforth, I really pursued nothing more than physiology, medicine, and natural sciences. And also in the autobiography, Ecce Homo, he complains about the blunder that he became a philologist. Why not at least a physician or something else that opens one's eyes? Okay? So there's a powerful contemporaneous naturalistic movement in philosophy and in intellectual culture more generally, and Nietzsche was very much part of this. Let me give you a well-known quotation from section 230 of Beyond Good and Evil, in which Nietzsche articulates in a sort of programmatic way this outlook. He says, "The task of philosophers is to repudiate what he calls the dignified verbal pageantry and the false old finery, debris, and gold dust of unconscious human vanity in order to recognize again what he calls the terrible basic text of Homo Natura." And now I quote from this passage. Nietzsche says, "To translate humanity back into nature, to gain control of the many vain and fanciful interpretations that have been scribbled and drawn over that terrible eternal basic text of Homo Natura so far, to make sure that from now on the human being will stand before the human being just as he already stands before the rest of nature today, hardened by the discipline of science, with courageous Oedipus eyes and sealed up Oedipus ears, deaf to the lures of the old metaphysical bird catchers who have been whistling to him for far too long, saying, 'You are more, you are higher, you have a different origin.'" Nietzsche, of course, is against the old metaphysical bird catchers. He wants to understand human beings as natural creatures, like the rest of nature, and explicable in terms of natural rather than strange or supernatural mechanisms. For Nietzsche, there is no immaterial soul, no free will, and no moralities with a divine or transcendental origin. It's crucial for Nietzsche, and this is one respect in which he's a bit like Hume, is that he is a kind of speculative naturalist. Right? That is, while Hume, of course, takes his inspiration from the success of Newtonian physical science, and then offers a speculative account of human nature and human motivations that is meant to sort of reproduce for the social and human world what Newton did for the physical world. Nietzsche's point of inspiration are the methods and discoveries of the 19th century physiological and life sciences, but, and this is crucial, right, Nietzsche's primary explanatory idiom is entirely the psychological one. Right? As he puts it at the end of the first chapter of Beyond Good and Evil, psychology is again the path to the fundamental problems. Right? And let me say a little bit more about this. The first chapter, Beyond Good and Evil, is devoted to discussing what he refers to as the prejudices of philosophers. These are prejudices like beliefs in the unconditional value of truth over falsehood, a belief in the will, a belief in the cogito, in the synthetic a priori, in absolute certainty, and even in laws of nature. Just as an aside, Nietzsche seems to have the slightly odd view that there are no nomic necessities, but there are necessities nonetheless. Nietzsche's approach to these prejudices of the philosophers is to offer a psychological diagnosis of them, right? And his analysis follows a standard sort of debunking pattern of argument that he uses all the time. His thesis is that you can explain a philosopher's commitments in the realm of metaphysics and epistemology, broadly speaking, in terms of their moral commitments. And he thinks you can then explain a philosopher's moral commitments in terms of facts about their psychology, about their needs and drives. So here's how he puts it in section 6 of Beyond Good and Evil. He says, every great philosophy so far has been the personal confession of its author in a kind of involuntary and unconscious memoir. And thus, to really grasp the philosophy, Nietzsche says, you have to ask, at what morality does all this aim? Or does he, the philosopher, aim, right? And the morality, Nietzsche says, simply bears decisive witness to who he is, by which Nietzsche says he means the innermost drives of his nature. So philosophers, on Nietzsche's view, or at least the great philosophers, advance claims not because they have epistemic support or good reasons for them, but ultimately to satisfy the psychological needs that they have, right? Now, Nietzsche's view here is certainly a pretty dismissive view of a lot of the philosophical tradition, right? He takes it for granted that there are no successful positive philosophical arguments for any position. I actually don't think that's that controversial a claim. He also notices that almost every position possible can be given what looks like a philosophical defense. And for Nietzsche, this is all post hoc rationalization. One of his favorite examples in this regard is Kant, right? He thinks, as it were, that Kant finally gives it all away when he admits that the point of his system is to put limits on knowledge to make room for faith, right? This is the giveaway that the whole thing is being driven by a certain kind of moral impulse, which then can admit of a psychological diagnosis. Because psychology is so important for Nietzsche, he's actually extremely critical of the tendency towards materialist reductionism of some of the German materialists. The German materialists, his contemporaries, were they had a mix of views, not always entirely consistent. Sometimes they were reductive materialists. Sometimes they talked in an idiom that might sound to us as kind of a limited materialism, right? But Nietzsche is against all of that, right? He is committed to the autonomy of psychology as a domain of adequate causal explanation of human beings. I want to turn to one particular case study of this to flesh it out in some detail of Nietzsche's approach, and this is his famous Genealogy of Morality, published in 1887. So the genealogy for Nietzsche is a naturalistic account, in particular an account of the psychological mechanisms that are supposed to have contributed to the rise of our Judeo-Christian morality. Let me just remark as an aside, and this is something I'm happy to talk about in Q&A. Nietzsche sometimes casts the net a bit wider, right? So one thing, Nietzsche, wider than Judeo-Christian morality. So for example, Nietzsche notices that that all the moralities of all the world's major religions have a strong ascetic dimension to them, right? As Nietzsche says, the pomp words of the ascetic ideal are chastity, poverty, and humility. Right? All the world's major religions have a high level of hostility to what Nietzsche takes to be certain natural desires that people have, such as the desire for sexual gratification, the desire for power, the desire for cruelty, and so on. Right? And so sometimes Nietzsche suggests that the puzzle is much broader than just Judeo-Christian morality, but encompasses, as it were, the planet as a whole, which he says might seem to be the ascetic planet par excellence. Okay, but back to, I'm going to just focus on Judeo-Christian morality, which is clearly his main target. As some of you will know, he was the son and grandson of Lutheran ministers, so he knew the Protestant tradition extremely well, and that is often becomes the overriding focus of his critique. In the preface to the genealogy, right, Nietzsche contrasts his now naturalistic approach to the approach he took as a very young person. He quotes from some notebook he wrote when he was 12 or 13 years old, in which he attributed the origin of morality to God. Right? That would be a supernatural explanation. And Nietzsche writes in the preface, he says, "Fortunately, I learned early on to distinguish theological from moral prejudice and no longer sought the origin of evil behind the world. A little historical and philological schooling, combined with an innate sense of discrimination in all psychological questions, soon transformed my problem into a different one. Under what conditions did man invent those value judgments, good and evil?" And in his autobiography, again, Ecce Homo, right, he gives a similar characterization of the first essay of the genealogy. Those of, just as a reminder, right, the first essay of the genealogy concerns what he calls the slave revolt in morality. And in Ecce Homo, he says, "The truth of the first inquiry is the birth of Christianity. The birth of Christianity out of the spirit of ressentiment," I'll say more about that in a second, "not, as people may believe, out of the spirit, a counter movement by its very nature, the great rebellion against the dominion of noble values." So the ambition of the genealogy is to examine the different origins of morality without appeal to supernatural beings like God, right? But rather in terms of certain psychological mechanisms that is part of his general speculative naturalism he attributes to human beings and thinks he has pretty good reason for attributing to them. And he buttresses his speculation about the actual motivations with a lot of actual implied or explicit historical evidence, and also famously etymological evidence, right? And this reflecting his training as a classical philologist. He's very interested in the fact that the words good and bad in many different ancient languages, right, actually tracked a distinction in the first place of social class, right, rather than the distinction marked by what Nietzsche calls the moralities of good and evil, which he associates with Judeo-Christian morality. And Nietzsche says in the preface that the goal is to provide a real history of morality, that is one which can be documented, which can really be ascertained, which has really existed, in short, the very long, difficult to decipher hieroglyphic writing of the human moral past. Okay. Now, what's the story that he tells us? And obviously, I'm not going to go through in detail the argument of the entire genealogy. But each essay of the genealogy is organized around a particular psychological hypothesis. Right? In the case of the first essay about the slave revolt in morals, the key mechanism is something Nietzsche calls ressentiment. Right? Nietzsche is actually using the German word ressentiment rather than the French word. This, of course, is lost in all English translations because it's italicized, but in the German, he never italicizes ressentiment because he's using the German word. And the German word does have a certain connotation that he's interested in, right? Namely, that people in the grips of ressentiment right, a bit like our English resentment, are in the grips of a kind of grudge, right, that they can't let go of. Right? More precisely, you can think of ressentiment as an impotent lust for revenge, right? A powerless lust for revenge. One wants revenge against someone or something or some entity or some organization, but you can't get actual revenge. And so you kind of stew in the juices of this, grudge, this desire to get revenge without being able to do so. And Nietzsche's hypothesis in the first essay is that those in the grip of an impotent lust for revenge, since they can't take an actual revenge, right? So think of your Homeric heroes, your Homeric epics, which are often in the background of what a lot of Nietzsche's thinking, right? In the Homeric epics, right, when someone wants revenge, they get it, okay? They take out their sword and they attack someone. Not the case with the slaves, right, who were the Jews in Israel, who are, what is now in Palestine, who are oppressed by the Romans at the time. Not the case with the early Christians in the Roman Empire, right? They indeed have a lust for revenge, but they can't really do much about their oppressors. And so they aim for what Nietzsche calls an imaginary or substitute revenge, namely that of revaluing values, right? Of taking the morality of their masters and turning it on its head, right? So whereas the master morality, as Nietzsche calls it, celebrated strength, power, military prowess, sexual gratification, glory, wealth, right? Christian morality stands all these values on their head, and this, Nietzsche thinks, is the imaginary revenge that is at the root of what he calls the first great revaluation of values. The second essay is concerned with a different psychological mechanism. Ressentiment will return to the stage again before the book is over. The second mechanism he appeals to in the second essay is what he takes to be an innate human desire or impulse towards cruelty. Nietzsche thinks, and again, if you read Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, or you read the Homeric epics, one could come away with the impression that human beings have a very strong impulse of cruelty towards others. On the other hand, Nietzsche observes that civilized life with other people would be impossible, right, if in fact there were not limitations placed on this impulse towards cruelty, right? We can't have people cannibalizing each other, raping each other, attacking each other all the time if society is to exist. Nietzsche has, like Freud after him, and I'll say more about Freud in a moment, Nietzsche has a kind of hydraulic picture of the mind and how instinctual energy works. So he thinks that if the instinct towards cruelty is denied outward discharge, it has to be discharged somewhere else. And Nietzsche's claim is that civilization forces the internalization of cruelty, which then gives rise to what he calls the bad conscience. That is the capacity of human beings to evaluate their own conduct in light of normative standards and to feel ashamed or ultimately to feel guilty, right, for what they do. So the capacity for guilt has its origin, according to Nietzsche, in this internalization of a fundamental human instinct of cruelty. Some of you will recognize that this argument is taken up in Freud's Civilization and its Discontents. It's a little different in Freud because Freud thinks the fundamental instinct is a death instinct, which comes into conflict with the fundamental instinct that Freud calls eros, the erotic instinct, which then turns the death instinct outwards as aggression, which society then forces to be internalized. Freud's account seems to me to involve the positing of a lot of explanatorily superfluous drives, in particular the death instinct. Seems to me that Nietzsche's is a cleaner version of the story. We have a good deal of evidence that people are inclined towards cruelty. We are seeing that right now in various parts of the world. And at the same time, it seems clear that society cannot permit unconstrained discharge of this impulse towards cruelty. And so Nietzsche's hypothesis, the internalization of cruelty now finds discharge internally through a sense of guilt, right? We are cruel to ourselves with our guilty conscience rather than cruel to others. The third essay of the genealogy introduces another explanatory mechanism. It may be the one that is most famously associated with Nietzsche, that sometimes travels under the heading of the will to power, and maybe during Q&A we'll talk a bit more about that. The thing to notice in the third essay of the genealogy is that will to power is given an explicitly psychological characterization. Right? Here's how he puts it in section 7 of the third essay. He says, every animal instinctively strives for an optimum of favorable conditions in which fully to release his power and achieve his maximum feeling of power, Machtgefühl. Every animal abhors equally instinctively, with an acute sense of smell higher than all reason, any kind of disturbance and hindrance which blocks or could block his path to the optimum. Okay? So this way of characterizing will to power, you can think of it almost as a kind of competitor to psychological hedonism. Right? Every animal instinctively, right, aims for conditions under which they can enjoy the maximum feeling of power. Right? That's the hypothesis. Now, the puzzle in the third essay, and this goes back to what I said already a few minutes ago, is why is it that ascetic ideals of self-denial, right? The denial of sexual gratification, of the pursuit of self-interest, of humility, right? Denial of pride, and so on. Why is it that ideals of self-denial, right, should have such a grip on humanity? Okay? And this is very striking for Nietzsche, again, because of his background as a classicist, because the Homeric world and the Greek world really before Plato and Socrates, right, these were not the kinds of ideals that had a grip on people, right? So there's a puzzle here. Why should ascetic ideals embodied in all the world's great religions have such a powerful influence on people? And in particular, how can we reconcile that with the hypothesis that every animal instinctively strives for the maximum feeling of power? Okay? Now, this is the most complicated psychological story Nietzsche wants to tell in the genealogy, and I'm going to give you a kind of condensed version of it. Nietzsche thinks that most human beings, right, the vast majority of mortals, as he says, are physiologically damaged and disgruntled. Right? Those of you not familiar with Nietzsche need to understand that Nietzsche has a rather low opinion of the vast majority of people. So he says the vast majority are disgruntled and damaged. That is, they suffer by nature, as it were. Right? And the thing about suffering is that all suffering gives rise to ressentiment. So ressentiment returns to the psychological story in the third essay. All suffering, right, gives rise to a desire for revenge, right? A desire to find somebody to blame for the suffering. Okay? And if all people are already in a state of suffering, right, and it gives rise to this powerful impulse to get revenge on someone or something for the suffering, right? If this ressentiment doesn't have an object against which to discharge itself, okay, Nietzsche thinks it's going to lead to what he literally calls suicidal nihilism. Right? He thinks life would simply be unbearable to suffer, to feel ressentiment, and to have no way to discharge, not to know who to blame for your suffering. Okay? That's the psychological, the more complicated hypothesis at work here in the third essay. Okay? And he thinks that it is the the great trick of those he calls the ascetic priests, right? The early founders of Judaism and Christianity, right? To come up with a solution to this problem, namely the teaching of the ascetic ideal, right? And here's how it's supposed to work. These religions teach, and Christianity in particular, right, teaches, right, that you are suppose that God has laid down before you, right, certain commands of self-denial, right? That you shouldn't act on your sexual desires, or your desire for your neighbor's wife, or your desire for power, or your desire for cruelty, and so on. Okay? That this is wrong. Okay? But in point of fact, all the people to whom this is addressed have these desires because Nietzsche thinks they are natural desires. Right? They are a feature of human nature. Therefore, all the adherents of these religions know that they stand in violation, right, of the norms that have been laid down by their creator in the Christian version. And this means they now have an explanation for their own suffering, because what the ascetic priest teaches them, right, is that they suffer precisely because they fail to live up to the ascetic ideal. They fail to live up to the morality that they are supposed to be bound by. In the Christian version, they suffer because they're sinners. Right? And now ressentiment has somewhere to go. Right? Nietzsche's idea is that the ressentiment of the person who was already suffering now has a direction. It can be directed against the sufferer himself. Right? You can blame yourself for your suffering, right? In the extreme form of the Christian doctrine of original sin, right? Your entire existence from the get-go, right, is blameworthy, right? Because you have inherited the original sin that occurred in the Garden of Eden. Now, this is, and sorry, I want to connect it back to the hypothesis about will to power. By giving a meaning to suffering, you suffer because you're a sinner. Right. The doctrine of the ascetic ideal gives ressentiment a direction. It is discharged against the person himself. And Nietzsche makes a very profound observation here, which is he says all strong emotions have an anesthetizing effect on pain. Mm-hmm. And he in particular thinks this is true about vengeance. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, there's very good empirical psychological evidence that this is true. That acting on motives of vengeance does actually release certain neurotransmitters that have a kind of anesthetizing effect in the psyche. Nietzsche didn't know this, but Nietzsche was a pretty good speculative psychologist. So it anesthetizes, at least temporarily, the suffering that the person began with, right? And right, at the same time, it thwarts suicidal nihilism. Right? It allows the sufferers to hang on to life because their suffering has a meaning. They know who to blame for it. They can make some sense of it. And as Nietzsche says, the one thing that is unbearable is not suffering, it's meaningless suffering. Right? And more precisely, the suffering needs a meaning so that the ressentiment has a direction. And for most people, Nietzsche thinks the maximum feeling of power they can achieve is simply self-preservation. Right? And this is the trick that he thinks this ascetic ideal performs. Okay. Now, I'm going to stop in just a minute. We can talk about how plausible these explanations are, what the evidence is that Nietzsche has for them. But what I'd like you to see is that this is Nietzsche's sort of speculative naturalistic psychology in operation, right? That he proposes certain mechanisms that he, through an inference to the best explanation, thinks provide an account of different features of the morality that we have inherited, right? The ressentiment driving the slave revolt in morals, the internalization of cruelty that explains the human capacity for guilt, right? And then the will to power conjoined with ressentiment and the fact of human suffering as an explanation for the appeal, the attraction that ascetic moralities exercise upon human beings. This is just one example, but I take it Nietzsche's whole mature corpus, basically from 1881's Daybreak on, is devoted to offering various kinds of naturalistic, psychologistic accounts, explanations for beliefs, and in particular values and moralities that human beings embrace. Though, let me say as my final point, it's important to realize for Nietzsche that his ultimate aim is a polemical one. The Genealogy of Morality is subtitled as a polemic. Right? Ultimately, he wants to disabuse at least some of his readers of their attachment to Judeo-Christian morality. One thing I've not talked about is how the naturalistic explanations connect up with the critique, though again, I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A if people are interested. So I think that's a good point for me to stop, and we still have about 20, 25 minutes. So thanks very much.